Hi, Plant ID students. Welcome to another week of lab. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create labels for your collected herbarium specimen. This is one of the final steps of a project, but even if you haven't ID'd your specimen, even if you're still working through that process, you can still do about 90% of this label. So I would suggest getting ahead, working on these labels now, so you have less to do later. Before I really begin, I'll be giving you a walkthrough of how to do this process. But remember to please always reference the instructions document, the plant collection instructions document in the project tab in Canvas. It is Erica's instructions telling you how to get an egg. Please always reference it. In those instructions is this picture that I have on screen now. This is an example of what one of those labels might look like by the myth, the legend, Jennifer Ackerfield. And I'll just very quickly go over the components of this label. So at the top, we have Flora of Colorado. That will be consistent across all of our labels. So if you're not in Colorado, write whatever state you're in. So we have Flora of your state, and then the county in which the specimen was collected. Under that, we have the identification of the specimen, so what family it was in, then the specimen, essentially all parts of how you would label the scientific name, which I'll go more into a little bit later. Then you have a short description of the plant and where it was found. Then you've got the geographic description of where it was found, along with the latitude and longitude, and some other basics, some basic information about where it was collected. Basically, this label is everything that you would have written down on your field notes when you collected the plant, either verbatim or at least summarized on this label. Now, there are tons of ways to do this. I'm going to show you a super easy way to make a little template for these labels. I'm just in a Word document right now. But first off, I want to make these margins narrow to accommodate the table that I'm about to make. Start on a new page. And under Insert, I suggest making a 2x3 table. And make that as big as you can while still fitting the page. And that looks about right to me. What's nice about doing this on Word is that there are rulers on the top and side of the page, because we want these labels to be about 4 by 3 inches. It's okay if they're not exactly those dimensions, but it looks like we got almost 4 and just about 3. And so that is 6 labels that you're able to get all on one page. I have already created another example. So let's switch to that document real quick. There we go. So here is an example of the label that I have made for this specimen right here. Ta-da! So I'm going to go through it just like I did the last one. Up top is collecting Colorado, so Flora of Colorado. And we're in Larimer County. I collected this from Weld County. Now here is the identification for the species, but I actually want to save that for last. We'll talk about the rest of it, because even if you don't have these 100% identified, you can still make most of this label. So in this section here, I'm describing the plant and where I found it. So pale yellow flowers, which they are definitely too tiny for you to see them. It is erect, herbaceous, and has red vertical stripes on the stem, about 7 inches tall, and it was common on the sandy soils on which I found it. There was no slope as well, and I'm a grass nerd, and so I also included the fact that I found it in a cattle grazed pasture dominated by Bootaloo, which is that grass right there. You don't have to include that, I did, because grass nerd. And then below it, I had information about the geographic location. There we go. USA, Colorado, none, which is the city. And then within one of my research sites, Central Plains Experimental Range. And then a very, very brief description of how to get to the place where I collected it. Left off Country Road 114, 2 miles from the entrance of this research site. Super simple, very brief. Latitude and longitude I include, and as well as the date, collector, the elevation, and the number, which this is the 4th plant I collected that day, so it's number 4. So those should be all of the notes that you took from your field notes summarized into this label. Now let's talk about what I skipped earlier, which is the identification. So here is what will probably be one of your final steps for this project. But using Colorado Flora, I was able to identify this plant down to Salsola, which I have a screenshot of right here. So I was able to identify it down to Salsola, and I had 2 choices here. One of the main differences here is whether or not the plant was prickly and difficult to handle, or whether it was easy to handle. This plant stabbed me many, many times. So with a high degree of confidence, I'm going to say that it is Salsola australis, I hope, the one that is difficult to handle because of all of its prickers. And so now that I have the ID, I am most of the way there. You can look this up, kind of backtrack your way, but you will find that this plant is a part of the Amaranthaceae. It is also in the subfamily of Chenopodiaceae. I included that in my label because admittedly, I was getting a little confused about which one it was in. So I included the subfamily. You don't need to. It was just helpful for me. But let's take a look at the name here. So exactly the bit that I have underlined right here, that is what you want to include as your identification. And there are multiple parts to this scientific name. The S, abbreviated here, Salsola, is the genus. Australis is the epithet. And R. Brown is the authority, basically the person who first described it and gets the credit of describing this plant. So let me show you how that got formatted. So there we are. There's the family, my note about the subfamily, and then Salsola tragus. Oops, I kind of spoiled it right there. But the species name, genus and epithet right there, those are in italics. And then the authority is not in italics. And then there you go. But saying it, I just kind of gave away the next thing I was going to talk about. Remember that this book is 10 years old and a lot can change in 10 years. Like I'm sure a lot of you will. I went to Google, I typed in Salsola australis, and yes, indeed, I saw images of things that looked like my plant. I thought, cool, good to go. But they were no longer listed as Salsola australis because remember, names get changed. We get more and more information, and that helps us reclassify these plants. But it also means that a book that's 10 years old might not be too accurate. And so remember, it is essential that you make sure you are using the most updated name possible. And so let's go to, let's see. I like to use Google Scholar for this. And so let's see. Oh, I lost my page. I am just going to type in Salsola australis. You can see that I've already done it. And I like to sort from the 2022 publication. So I'm only getting the absolute most recent publications on this species. Let's see, and yes, indeed, here are a few from 2022. And overwhelmingly, I'm seeing nothing but Salsola tragus. And I trust these published journals to be accurately reflecting the most modern name. There are many, many different ways to figure out what the proper name is. Admittedly, I just trust my fellow scientists to tell me what's what. So I like to use Google Scholar, but there are tons of ways to do it. You can look at maybe the most recent herbarium samples of your particular species. There are a bunch of different internet databases where they also list the most updated names. Whichever way you do it is fine, as long as you're making sure you are getting this most updated name. And yes, indeed, there is a picture of the plant that I have here. And so that is all the information that we need to include. Where's mine? There it is. And so now that I am confident about everything on that label, I'm confident about the ID, I'm happy with all of the information that I have reflected on this label, I'm now going to print it out, and I will just show you a good way to affix this to your specimen. Whoops, I realized that I almost forgot to include one important bit of information. So if you notice on my identification section on my label, I have a lot less information than the example included in the plant collections document. That's because in this example, this species is identified down to subspecies. So you might remember seeing on your field notes, there's a section for rank and subspecies. It's already there. For the purposes of this class, don't worry about that. We are not asking you to identify down to any subspecies. Many of the plants don't even have them. And so if you do see any sort of subspecies in here, don't worry about it. That's not a focus of this particular class. So what I have here on my example is 100% sufficient. Now we are on the last stage of this labeling process. I have printed out my labels, cut out the one that I want to use, and now it is ready to be glued on. Once again, I'm just going to take Old Faithful here, Elmer's glue, and I'm just going to put a little bit, particularly on the corners of this label. And you don't want to drown this in glue, because if you realize you've made a mistake, if you drown the label in glue, you're going to really have a hard time getting it off. So just some dabs around the corner, one in the center for good luck is really all you need. And then I am going to glue this to my specimen in the bottom right corner. Make sure it is straight. Hold it there a few seconds to make sure you've got a good bond. If your paper's kind of curling like mine is, you might need to put some books on it, something to keep it a little bit flat while it dries. And there you have it. That is what a completed herbarium specimen looks like. And so for the sake of your project, this would represent one of your 10 species. Ain't it pretty? If you have any questions, let me know.